Hi, my name is Paddy Nixon. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra, and I'm here this morning to talk to Michelle Grattan about a week in politics. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Paddy.
I'm sat out in the little bit of sunshine between many raining sessions here in Canberra. And that must be a little bit how it feels for Scott Morrison this week. I think it's been last couple of weeks of sitting have been quite challenging. Omicron has been discovered in Australia, and that's obviously asked the government to delay the international border opening. And then, of course, we've had the issue of the Jenkin Report on parliamentary workplace behaviours has been released, and quite some shocking data in there. 1 in 3 people have experienced some form of sexual harassment while in the workplace in federal parliament. And then we've had a series of resignations or stepping back. Christian Porter and Greg Hunt have said they won't contest the next election. Alan Tudge has stepped aside while there's an investigation into allegations he disputes. And then, of course, those strange happenings in the Senate. A Liberal senator barking at Jackie Lambie, or allegedly barking, and then the offensive language between 2 senators, Lydia Thorne and Holly Hughes. So let's start, I suspect, with Omicron, which is an interesting challenge in itself. How's the government reacting to Omicron? And do they still see it as a threat, or are they more concerned about moving on from COVID?
I think the government's had a dual reaction. It is being cautious, and we saw the opening of the border to workers and students being delayed by a fortnight while more information became available. And that's the sign of the caution. But also, we've had a very strong message from Scott Morrison, from Josh Frydenberg and others, that we don't want to go back to lockdowns, that we do have to learn to live with the virus, that there will be more variations, and therefore that we should not be too panicky. We should look to an open Christmas. People should get out and spend that money which has been accumulating in savings during the lockdowns that we've had. And of course, this week we had national income figures which showed that Australia went backwards in terms of economic growth in the September quarter. All the indications are that now we're out of that lockdown period. We're starting to get the economy pushing along in a very positive sense, but the government wants to see that validated and improved further as we go through the holiday period.
And I'm just intrigued about internal borders as well as our external ones. There's still sort of little hints of tension there between states and Commonwealth. The border between WA and South Australia closed again. How do we see that playing out, and what's the federal government's view of it?
The federal government always wants the borders open as much as possible internally, but I think it also realises that the state governments have had strong support. Those states that have not had many cases, WA, South Australia, Queensland, and that taking on the premiers doesn't really have any impact on what the premiers do and can be negative politically. So it's just mostly stepping back from that argument, although the argument does flare from time to time.
And then just moving on to the significant news this week, the release of the Jenkins Report. Do you think the recommendations from it will be implemented by the government?
Both sides of politics have embraced the report generally. They've been expressing how appalled they are at what has been found. They've been saying they support it in the broad, but neither side, neither the Coalition nor Labor, have said they will implement all the recommendations. And I don't think that they will, whether Labor's in power after the election or whether the Coalition's still in power. I think that some of the recommendations they regard as maybe cutting across existing systems or not being so practical or whatever. So I think that they are keeping their powder dry in terms of the detail, even though they're supporting the general thrust of the recommendations, and much will be implemented. And some things, of course, have been implemented from previous investigation and other decision making.
And look, it sort of goes without saying that this report is highly significant, but what are the long-term implications for it? Is it as significant as it feels today?
Well, one would think that after all that's happened this year and this report this week, it would be having more practical impact on politicians' behaviour than it seems to have. We have been through an appalling week of just bad parliamentary behaviour. You reference some of the incidents, people's comments. So you really have to wonder, and to some extent despair. I think that having said that, politicians in their conduct will be more cautious, if not in their language in Parliament. But we have seen, for example, this week, Alan Tudge, the Education Minister, as you said, having to step aside after his former lover, former staffer, made fresh allegations about his conduct towards her. They were very dramatically timed, coming in the week of the Jenkins Report and the last day of Parliament, and the Prime Minister, who is very sensitive now to the impact of the women's issues and the effect that that could have on him and the government, made Tudge stand aside very quickly and launched an investigation into those allegations. So I think that in terms of behaviour by politicians, especially personal relationships and so on, it's going to be a signal to them that they really have to improve their behaviour somewhat, or a lot.
And just going back to you identified the allegations there again against Minister Tudge. What do you think the implications are and the effect on the government will be from those allegations?
I think it's added to the impression of some chaos and scandal surrounding the government, and that is not a good look, obviously. Whether those things, however, recede more into the background as we get closer to the election and people focus on what is important to them, especially economic issues, and whether Labor looks a competitive alternative, then we get a bit more context for the events of the recent weeks, which are so much in our minds at the moment. But the chaos, the attacks on the Prime Minister's character, and the element of scandal are nevertheless factors that will feed into people's perception of the government.
You mentioned there that whether Labor will be a credible alternative to government. Today is a critical element of that, the announcement of their climate policy. How much is at stake here for the opposition in this policy?
I think a lot is at stake because it has made the climate issue a central one in its attacks on the government. We've been waiting a long time for the policy. It's going to be announced later this morning, but we're already getting some leaks suggesting that Labor's embracing a 2030 target of reducing emissions by some 43%. Now, that's a little less ambitious than it took to the last election, but it's more ambitious than the government, which, of course, didn't change its target adopted in Paris, but said that emissions are projected to fall by up to 35% by 2030 under its policies. I think that it will depend on whether Labor seems to have a credible plan for getting to this target, and also of course, on the extent to which the government succeeds in demonising the Labor policy, as it did fairly successfully at the last election. So it'll be a challenge for Labor to sell this policy. I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see Anthony Albanese accelerating in general his efforts, and he's got a big rally on Sunday, for example, and likely more policy in another area then. But a lot of attention will be turning, despite the chaos we've been through in the government ranks, a lot of attention will be turning to the opposition in these short weeks before Christmas. And it really does need to step up its efforts, I think, because it has seemed to be concentrating or relying more on the government's problems than getting its own pitch out there in recent times.
The other piece of news this week that I found fascinating was this notion of there only being 10 sitting days between now and August. Clearly, that's indicating an election coming up. And everybody likes to do a little bit of election guessing when it will happen. What do you think it says about when the election is likely to happen, Michelle?
The sitting calendar for next year came out this week, and what it has is only a very few days in the first half of the year when we'll see the election, but it does factor in a budget on March 29. Now, that calendar can be torn up. If the Prime Minister came through summer and thought, oh, I'm in a really good position, I don't want the Parliament back, I'll have a March election, he can do that. However, his preference at the moment, as we know, is for a May election with a March budget framing that election. So that is the current likelihood, but no certainty. There's a lot of flexibility there in the Prime Minister's hands.
Well, look, thank you very much, Michelle. Fascinating as always. And I think this is our last one before Christmas. So I wish you a wonderful Christmas.
Thanks, Paddy. Good to talk, and great Christmas to you and our viewers.